Hi there everyone, it's Dr. Scott. So I've read through everybody's Essay 1 drafts. I've sent feedback to all but one or two people in the class at this point, and I have a sense of what some of the major trends are that we need to work on in that draft. So the screencast is going to cover 3 or 4 trends that I noticed in the drafts that I looked at over the weekend. I think everybody could benefit from giving this screencast a look. There were some folks that had their head around the assignment a little bit more than others, and that's absolutely fine. A draft is a draft, and your grade on the draft had nothing to do about the how good the draft was. I don't think that's right to do that. But I did kind of wanted to put together the screencast that I think would that would help everybody address at least one issue in their draft. So here's the things that I was noticing. So I noticed that there were issues with organization, integrating sources, using examples in their paper, focusing paragraphs on concepts, and then there were some miscellaneous things, some pet peeves of mine. So I'm going to go through each of these, and I'm going to use examples from your essays to kind of illustrate some of these points. And it's not to call anybody out and to put their name on the board in any kind of way or anything like that. I just think it's easier to understand some of these ideas when you see them in people's writing rather than me just talking about them in an abstract way. Okay, so let's talk about the first one, which is organization. So when I'm talking about organization is the idea that each paragraph should be placed in your essay for a specific reason. Like I should not be able to take a paragraph out of your essay, put it in a different part of your essay, and it more or less makes no impact on your writing. There should be a reason why each paragraph, why each idea is located in the place that you have it. So here's an example of a writer that I think could focus on that, and I think that this was probably the most important issue and the most prevalent issue among everybody's essay. I think there was only maybe 1 or 2 people that actually had this organization idea kind of figured out. So it takes a little bit of thinking, and it's not going in and changing words. It's actually rethinking how you've kind of structured your writing, which again takes a little bit more involvement. So we have a paragraph that's about more or less defining what communication is. We have another paragraph about 2 different kinds of communication, and then we have a paragraph about being able to communicate with people of all different backgrounds, so like the Pellegrini video. So for me, like as I'm reading this, I'm questioning, okay, why am I going from this to this to this? And it's not really made clear to me in the writing, and the writing does have to kind of explain what's the connection here. And I think that there might be a good reason to go from here to here, but I'm really lost going from this to this. And so the feedback that I gave folks is that you could set up an essay where you're going from the most important concept in communicating in your field to the least important concept, or the first, when somebody starts in this discipline or in this major, the first issue that they learn as far as communication is this, and then it's this other thing, and then this other. Those of you that have done your kind of work, there's a few of you that are in emergency medical fields, and you guys do that work. Like you could probably speak to that already. You could say, like, you know what, when I first started the job, I really had to learn how to communicate with my teammate in the ambulance, and then I had to be able to communicate with these other folks, and I learned how to communicate with patients. So I mean, think about it, most important to least important. Maybe think about relationships, like people that you have to communicate on the job, and thinking about what's the most important, or maybe the most time intensive, or maybe the most difficult. There has to be some kind of logic to why you're going from one idea to another. So I hope that makes some sense. Some of you used section headings like different relationships, communicating with patients, and then communicating with other healthcare providers. I think that's awesome. Again, there needs to be a reason why you're starting with one section and then going on to the second section. And there also needs to be organization within those sections. Like, why do you begin with this one paragraph in a section about communicating with patients and then go on to this other paragraph? Some of it is an issue of transitioning. So maybe this in here, we just need more transitioning. So we ended this paragraph with understanding that communication is important, and then this next paragraph is about these 2 different forms of communication. So in order to kind of pick up at the thread that we ended this paragraph with, you might do something like this. So in order to master communication in this field, we need to understand that there are two different kinds of communication, indirect and direct communication. So that might clarify things a little bit. Just adding some transitioning, that could help. But then there are places, and I think that this is true for most people that have this issue, it's not just adding a few words ain't going to cover it. You need to have a reason. You need to rethink why you have ideas placed in the location that you have them. So this race idea here, which is interesting and smart, and I'm really glad that this writer's talking about it, maybe this just needs to go somewhere else. So it's regrouping some of the paragraphs and the ideas that you have in your essay and getting those grouped together in a more logical fashion, and then making that logic more evident to your writer through the use of transitions, through the use of section headings, and kind of explaining the organization. So that's the first trend that I noticed. The second trend is integrating sources. So everybody read Stedman's article about the annoying ways people use sources, and I kind of referenced some of those in your writing. In my comments, like I think you're committing to Spider-Man annoyance, what have you. But the one that what I found to happen most frequently is that people would begin or end paragraphs with discussing a source, or they would set up paragraphs that would just be about a source, and that's not really what the assignment's asking you to do. It's not to talk about what are the most important, what sources talk about communication in your field. It's like, how does your field define effective communication? And so the paragraphs need to focus on concepts that you've learned about in your research. So here, beginning a paragraph with the McCool article provides an outline of how healthcare provides a relationship with a patient successfully. And then it goes on to talk about like how you build that. The beginning of the paragraph is framed around a specific source, but what you really kind of need is, what is the main concept that we're learning about here? Maybe it's this compassion idea. Maybe it's listening. The main point of the essay isn't really clear to me, because the way that the source is integrated, I'm not sure how to interpret it, because the paragraph begins with a source and it doesn't really provide much context. So the way to fix that is to kind of begin with your ideas, like the concept you're trying to get across. It's what I call the quote sandwich. You begin with something like an essential aspect of communicating in medicine is understanding the patient's perspective, for example. So it begins with the point that you're trying to make. You use the article to help you support it, and then you have to talk about that article afterwards. There were maybe 2 or 3 of you that would include a source, and then you would kind of, what we'd call source stacking. You would include one source, and then you would kind of add another source to it without discussing that. So you need to begin, the top part of your quote sandwich is your idea. The second part is the quote itself. And then the third part, the bottom part, is you discussing that quote and connecting it to your paper, and help, in explaining how it helps you answer the research question. So integrating sources was an issue I found in maybe half of the drafts that I read. About half of us could still use some work in making sure that we're integrating sources. There were a significant number of folks that had a problem with just making sure that you're using sources at all. There was maybe 4 or 5 people that provided a lot of anecdotal evidence. They made a lot of claims, and they didn't necessarily back them up. And that's an issue as well, but it's kind of separate from like how you're integrating sources. The fourth issue I noticed is using examples to support what it is you have to say. Those of you that you're not sure how you're going to get to the word requirement, you're kind of freaking out because you're not exactly finding You're not finding a ton of research in your discipline to support what it is what you have to say. You're going to want to listen up to this, because I think that has some feedback that might be able to help. So let me grab an essay that we can talk about here. There it is right there. This is an essay that I think this person has some background, and I think the writer is providing a few notes, like make sure that I cite this, and I actually really like that the writer does that, because how you're citing something doesn't matter right now. Like in a draft, you just say, hey, I need to cite this here. That I'm okay with that. But there are a lot of claims that are made here that are not really backed up or supported with evidence. And so what I think is what the writer can do, and what you all could do, is like, so you take something like quoting Marjorie Lee North, and then instead of just doing this kind of abstract discussion, like learning effective two-way communication and understanding that people may have different communication styles, can eliminate professionals feeling that they're not being heard or things are getting misinterpreted. So it's kind of talking about the North article in an abstract sense. What the writer could do is to just, for example, in a professional setting, provide an example, provide a scenario in which you can talk about how some of this research might play out in your discipline or in your field. I think that can be super helpful. And those of you that did that, I think I commented on that and how useful that was to get me to understand where you were coming from, and really kind of help you answer the research question in a kind of detailed way. Informed by your research, but then you're then taking that research and you're providing an example of how it could actually work. Okay. The last major one is a focus on making sure that you're focusing on concepts. And that kind of gets back to the earlier discussion about how we're integrating sources. And so like here, there's in the North article, again, that puts the focus of the paragraph on the article, not necessarily on the concept that you're trying to get across. And I think that's an issue fewer people had an issue with, but it's an important one, and you want to make sure that you kind of get your head across, or your head around, and figure out how you can focus your writing on the concepts that you're trying to get across. If you're confused by that, let me know, because I think there's ways to take like a paragraph like this and say, where it's focusing mostly on what North had to say, and you could turn it into something like, important issue to consider in communicating my field is the need to resolve conflict in a respectful manner. That's a concept. Focusing on North, that puts the emphasis on her writing. I want the emphasis to be on your writing, like the idea that you're trying to get across. Okay. Really quickly, I know that this is a long video so far. Two other things that I want to get across, and that's the use of the word things and the use of the word you. Things, least descriptive word in the English language. Totally fine for conversations, but not great if you're trying to impress people through your writing. So do away with things. There's always a better alternative, and if you have a hard time thinking of alternatives, let me know. Finally, the word you, especially with this article, because it's about your discipline. You writing you, that's like you writing specifically to me, and I'm not going to be an engineer. I'm not going to be a healthcare professional. This is about you. This is about the word I. It could be where you use physician assistant or dental hygienist or emergency medical technician. You can use that third person where you're talking about other people, but you could also use the word I. I'm absolutely fine with that. The word you, though, really doesn't work. The example that I give students that I teach most frequently is I had a student at New Mexico State that was writing a paper about teenage pregnancy, and she began an essay with, like, when you're pregnant, these are the things you need to think about. And I told her, I look like I have a beer gut, but I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get pregnant anytime soon. So that use of the word you doesn't really work for all audiences. It assumes that you're talking directly to people when you're really you can talk to a specific audience, but you want to talk from your own perspective, the I, or from that third person perspective. But to be able to talk to the you, that's a little in people's face. Okay, so I or that third person. That's the feedback that I have. Again, sorry for the long video, but hopefully you find this helpful. If you have any questions, email me.